If this test fails, I lose more than money.
Yeah. You understand what this could do to your family? I think the damage was already there long before this.
And if they discover the truth too early?
They won't. Every detail has to feel real.
You can learn more about people when they think nothing is being watched. Success gave them comfort, but comfort changes people. And now I need to know who they really are.
My father built this empire for his family. Someone needs to step up.
The estate process is still under review. Review takes time we may not have.
Your father's wishes will be respected exactly as instructed.
And I hope you understand who's most capable of protecting this company.
You're irresponsible, Daniel. Dad knew that better than anyone.
At least I'm not pretending to be some perfect replacement for him.
This isn't about emotions. It's about who's prepared.
And you think you are?
I think I understand this family better than you do.
In the first moments of his confession, the billionaire didn't look like a man who owned half the city. He looked like someone carrying a weight he had finally stopped trying to hide. He said there are moments in life when money stops being a blessing and starts becoming a question of who around you is truly there for you and who is only there for what you have. For years he believed his family was his greatest achievement, his wife who had stood beside him through struggle, his children who grew up in luxury he never had, and a home that symbolized everything he built from nothing. But one quiet evening, sitting alone in his study, he asked himself a question that changed everything. If all of this disappeared tomorrow, who would still stay? That single thought didn't leave him. It grew heavier each day until it turned into a decision that would shake the foundation of his own family. Before anyone knew what was happening, he began to prepare a test so carefully constructed that no one would suspect it was even in motion. A sudden health crisis was announced, the kind that forces families to reveal their true nature under pressure. Within hours, his household changed. Concern turned into urgency turned into quiet competition, and behind every comforting word began to hide questions about inheritance, control, and survival. The men who once trusted every seat at his dinner table now watched from a distance as each person reacted in ways he never expected. And then came the moment he had been both waiting for and fearing, the moment the first real crack appeared in the image of the family he believed was unshakable. But what he did not anticipate was how quickly things would escalate once money, fear, and expectation entered the same room. And just when it seemed like everything had been set in motion exactly as planned, something happened that forced him to question whether he truly understood his own family at all. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The man at the center of this story is Richard Caldwell, a self-made billionaire whose empire was built from years of sacrifice, calculated risks, and a belief that loyalty meant everything. To the outside world, the Caldwell family represented success, unity, and legacy. But Richard had begun to notice something unsettling in the very home he had built. The warmth that once filled his mansion had slowly been replaced by distance, unspoken expectations, and conversations that ended the moment he walked into a room. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about intention, about what remained when money was no longer a guarantee. And so the question formed in his mind, was his family truly bound by love, or had comfort replaced connection long ago? Was this a test of loyalty, or something far more revealing about who they had become when everything was on the line? Who would be the first to cross a line if it meant securing their future, and who would hesitate even for a moment when faced with temptation? Richard began to watch his wife, Margaret Caldwell, more closely, a woman who had shared his journey from the beginning, but whose silence had grown heavier over time. Then there were his children, each shaped differently by wealth: Andrew Caldwell, the eldest son who carried entitlement like it was inheritance itself; Vanessa Caldwell, sharp and strategic, always thinking 3 steps ahead; and Daniel Caldwell, the youngest, often overlooked, quiet, and dismissed as inexperienced. But the question that haunted Richard most was not about the loudest or the boldest among them. It was about the one who never asked for anything. The one who stayed in the background, observing everything while saying the least. Because sometimes, silence is not emptiness, it is awareness. And in a family where everyone seemed to be preparing for something, Richard could not ignore the feeling that the real story had not even begun yet. Who would betray him first if given the chance, and more importantly, what would that betrayal look like when money and legacy were on the line? And why was it that every decision, every conversation, and every subtle change in behavior seemed to point toward one uncomfortable truth that Richard was not ready to accept? Richard Caldwell was not born into comfort, and that was something he never allowed himself to forget. Long before the mansions, the boardrooms, and the headlines, there was a version of him that worked late into the night with no guarantee that any of it would pay off. He built his empire from the ground up, one decision at a time, one risk after another, learning quickly that nothing of value comes without discipline. To him, money was never just currency, it was proof of effort, sacrifice, and resilience. And above all, it was meant to be protected and passed on with purpose. Richard didn't just believe in success, he believed in earning it, and that belief shaped how he saw the world, how he raised his children, and how he judged the people closest to him. He wasn't just rich, he was a man who believed everything had to be earned, and that included trust. Margaret Caldwell had been there long before the world knew Richard's name. She stood beside him through the years when there was more uncertainty than comfort, when every small win felt like survival. She carried herself with a quiet elegance that people admired, the kind of presence that commanded respect without ever needing to demand it. But over time, something subtle shifted. The struggles that once bonded them were replaced by routines, and the passion that once defined their relationship slowly settled into familiarity. Margaret had grown accustomed to the life Richard built, the luxury, the stability, the predictability of it all. And while she never openly asked for more, there was a distance that neither of them addressed. She stood beside him for decades, but somewhere along the way, love became comfort. Their children grew up in a world completely different from the one Richard had known. Andrew Caldwell, the eldest, carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything. He moved through life expecting doors to open, believing that his position in the family already guaranteed his future. Vanessa Caldwell was different, sharp, observant, always calculating. She didn't rely on assumptions, she planned, she analyzed, and she understood the power that came with being prepared. Then there was Daniel Caldwell, whose decisions often placed him on the edge of trouble, chasing quick rewards without fully understanding the cost. He lived fast, spent freely, and rarely looked back long enough to consider the consequences. But among them all, there was someone who rarely entered the conversation. Ethan Caldwell. He wasn't the loudest, the boldest, or the most ambitious in the way the others were. He didn't compete for attention, and he didn't seem interested in proving anything to anyone. While the others embraced the lifestyle that came with their last name, Ethan kept his distance from it, choosing simplicity in a world defined by excess. He watched more than he spoke, listened more than he reacted, and in a house filled with strong personalities, he became easy to overlook. And then, there was the one nobody paid attention to. Richard saw all of it. Every pattern, every attitude, every unspoken expectation that had quietly taken root over the years. What once looked like a strong family now appeared to him as a group of individuals shaped more by privilege than by principle. And that realization stayed with him, growing heavier until it demanded action. Because if everything he built was to be passed on, it had to go to someone who understood its value beyond the numbers. And that's exactly why he chose them, for the test. Richard Caldwell did not rush into the decision, and that was what made it so precise. Every detail was planned with the same discipline he had used to build his empire. Quietly, without drawing attention, he reached out to the only two people he trusted to carry out something this delicate, his longtime attorney, Charles Whitman, and a private physician, Dr. Harris. These were men who had seen Richard at his most vulnerable and his most powerful, and they understood that when he made a decision like this, it was never without reason. Behind closed doors, conversations took place that would never be recorded, agreements were made that would change the course of his family's future, and a scenario was constructed so carefully that even those closest to him would never question its reality. The announcement came suddenly, just as Richard intended. A severe health condition, unexpected, aggressive, and with very little time left. The news spread through the Caldwell household like a shockwave. Margaret Caldwell was the first to arrive at the hospital, her composure steady on the surface, but her silence heavier than usual. Andrew Caldwell followed, already asking questions that went beyond concern, questions about timelines, about decisions that needed to be made. Vanessa Caldwell stood back, observing everything, her mind moving faster than her words, already considering possibilities no one else had voiced. Daniel Caldwell reacted emotionally at first, but even his distress carried an undercurrent of uncertainty, as if he was trying to calculate what this meant for him before fully processing what it meant for his father. Ethan Caldwell arrived last. He said very little, standing quietly beside the hospital bed, his attention fixed not on the situation around him, but on Richard himself. There were no questions about assets, no subtle attempts to gain clarity on what would come next. Just presence. Just stillness. And in that silence, Richard noticed something that none of the others seemed to understand. Days passed, and the situation became more intense. Charles Whitman gathered the family and informed them that Richard's condition required immediate decisions regarding his estate. The will, he explained, was being reviewed. Not finalized, but reconsidered. Certain conditions would determine how everything would be distributed, and those conditions would depend not on what was said, but on what was done in the days ahead. The room shifted. What began as concern slowly transformed into awareness. And awareness began to shape behavior. Margaret Caldwell, once composed and distant, became more involved, asking questions she had never asked before, showing an interest in details she had long ignored. Andrew Caldwell grew more assertive, positioning himself as the natural successor, speaking with confidence about leadership and responsibility as if the decision had already been made. Vanessa Caldwell became quieter, more strategic, her actions subtle but deliberate, choosing her moments carefully. Daniel Caldwell moved unpredictably, sometimes emotional, sometimes withdrawn, as though he was struggling to find his place in a situation he did not fully control. And Ethan Caldwell remained the same. Observing. Listening. Unchanged. What started as concern slowly turned into something else. Conversations became guarded. Intentions became less clear. And the bond that once held the Caldwell family together began to show signs of strain under pressure that none of them were prepared to handle. Richard watched it all from behind the illusion he had created. Every word, every decision, every reaction was being noted. He was no longer just a father in a hospital bed, he was a man measuring truth in its rawest form. And then, just when it seemed like the tension could not rise any further, someone made a move that crossed a line no one expected to be crossed so soon. And then, the first betrayal happened. The shift inside the Caldwell family did not happen all at once, it unfolded in layers, each action revealing something that had likely been there long before Richard Caldwell ever stepped into that hospital bed. What began as concern had now taken on a different tone, one shaped by urgency, uncertainty, and the growing awareness that nothing about the future was guaranteed anymore. Andrew Caldwell was the first to act with intention. He began inserting himself into every legal conversation, requesting updates from Charles Whitman, questioning timelines, and subtly pushing for clarity on decisions that had not yet been made. What sounded like responsibility on the surface carried a deeper motive underneath, a need to secure his position before anyone else could challenge it. He framed his involvement as necessary, as if he were stepping up for the family, but the consistency of his presence made it clear he was not willing to leave anything to chance. Vanessa Caldwell approached the situation differently. She did not push her way into conversations, she created them. Quietly, strategically, she arranged private discussions with both Charles Whitman and Dr. Harris, asking questions that seemed measured but carried significant weight. She wanted to understand every detail, every possibility, every condition that could influence the outcome of Richard's estate. Where Andrew sought control through visibility, Vanessa sought it through information. She applied pressure without raising her voice, making it difficult to refuse her without drawing attention. It wasn't emotional, it was calculated, and that made it even more effective. At some point, documents began to go missing. Not entire files, not anything obvious enough to cause immediate alarm, but pieces, notes, copies, fragments of information that could shift understanding if placed in the right hands. No one openly admitted to taking them, but the tension in the room made it clear that trust was no longer part of the equation. Daniel Caldwell, already struggling to find stability in the situation, became increasingly erratic. He questioned everything, doubted everyone, and began making calls outside the family, as if preparing for an outcome where he would be left with nothing. His actions were less controlled, but no less revealing. Margaret Caldwell's change was quieter, but just as significant. She began to distance herself emotionally, no longer engaging with the situation as a wife, but as someone observing from the outside. And slowly, almost without realizing it, she aligned herself more closely with Andrew. Whether it was because he appeared confident, or because he seemed most capable of maintaining the life she had grown used to, her support became noticeable. It was not spoken, but it was understood. The balance within the family had shifted, and she had chosen where to stand. Then came the moment everything broke open. What had been building beneath the surface finally found its way into the open during a single conversation that quickly turned into something much larger. Accusations were made, not carefully, not strategically, but emotionally. Andrew questioned Daniel's reliability, Vanessa challenged Andrew's intentions, and Daniel, already on edge, responded without restraint. Years of unspoken tension surfaced all at once, turning the room into something unrecognizable. What was once a family discussion became a confrontation, each person defending their place, their expectations, their perceived right to what Richard had built. In just days, the family he built began to collapse. And through all of it, Ethan Caldwell remained the one constant that did not change. He did not argue, he did not defend a position, and he did not attempt to claim anything. While the others fought over what might be theirs, Ethan focused on what was in front of him. He continued to visit Richard without asking questions, without seeking answers, without positioning himself for anything beyond being present. His actions were simple, but in the middle of everything else, they stood out more than anyone realized. While everyone else was focused on the money, one person was focused on something else. Richard saw it all. Every reaction, every decision, every word spoken in tension or in calculation. The test he had designed was no longer just revealing behavior, it was exposing truth in its rawest form. But even as the situation reached a level he had anticipated, there was a moment approaching that would go beyond anything he had prepared for. A moment that would force every person in that room to face something they could not take back. But the worst moment was still coming. The moment arrived without warning, just as Richard Caldwell had intended from the very beginning. Early that morning, a call was placed to each member of the Caldwell family, brief, controlled, and final in its tone. Richard Caldwell had passed away during the night. There were no long explanations, no room for questions, just a statement that brought everything to a sudden stop. For a few seconds, silence followed on every line, the kind of silence that forces people to confront what they truly feel when there is nothing left to prepare for. Margaret Caldwell was the first to respond, her voice breaking in a way that suggested both grief and disbelief, though even in that moment, there was something restrained about it, as if part of her had already begun processing what came next. Andrew Caldwell reacted quickly, asking about arrangements, about timing, about what needed to be done. His words carried urgency, but not all of it was emotional. Vanessa Caldwell said very little, absorbing the information in silence, her thoughts already moving ahead of the moment, analyzing what this meant for everything that had been left unresolved. Daniel Caldwell's reaction was louder, more immediate, filled with shock, but even his response faded quickly into uncertainty, as if the reality of what came next was beginning to weigh on him. And Ethan Caldwell said nothing at all. He simply ended the call and made his way to the house. By the time they gathered again, the atmosphere had changed completely. The tension that once built gradually was now replaced with something more direct, more undeniable. This was no longer about possibility, it was about outcome. Some showed grief openly, allowing emotion to take over in a way that felt genuine, or at least necessary. Others held themselves differently, more controlled, more focused, their attention shifting toward what would follow. The absence of Richard Caldwell did not bring the family closer, it exposed the distance that had already formed between them. Later that day, they were called into the main sitting room, a space that had once held family gatherings, celebrations, and moments that now felt distant. Charles Whitman stood at the front, holding a document that carried more weight than anyone in the room was willing to admit. No one spoke as he prepared to begin. Every person present understood that whatever came next would define not just their future, but everything that had unfolded over the past few days. Margaret Caldwell sat still, her expression unreadable. Andrew Caldwell leaned forward slightly, his focus fixed entirely on the document in Charles Whitman's hands. Vanessa Caldwell remained composed, her attention sharp, watching not just the lawyer, but everyone else in the room. Daniel Caldwell shifted in his seat, unable to hide the tension that had taken hold of him. And Ethan Caldwell sat quietly, just as he always had, present but removed from the intensity that surrounded him. Charles Whitman adjusted his posture, opened the document, and allowed a brief pause to settle over the room. It was not long, but it was enough to make every second feel heavier than the last. This was the moment everything would be revealed. Charles Whitman allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to settle uneasily over the room before he began to read. His voice was steady, measured, every word deliberate as he spoke about Richard Caldwell's legacy, his values, and the importance of responsibility. At first, it sounded like any other will reading, structured, formal, expected. But then his tone shifted, almost imperceptibly, and the words that followed did not describe a final distribution of wealth, they described a condition, a process, something that had already taken place. The room grew still, each person trying to understand what they were hearing, trying to place meaning where there should have been clarity. And then, just as confusion began to take hold, something happened that no one in that room was prepared for. The doors behind them opened. No one turned immediately, as if their minds refused to accept what their senses had already registered. But when they did, when each of them finally looked, the reality of what stood before them broke through every assumption they had made. Richard Caldwell walked into the room, not as a memory, not as a name in a document, but as the same man they had believed was gone. The shock was immediate, visible on every face, disbelief replacing certainty in a matter of seconds. Margaret Caldwell rose halfway from her seat, unable to fully process what she was seeing. Andrew Caldwell froze, his composure slipping for the first time since the beginning of the ordeal. Vanessa Caldwell's expression tightened, her focus sharpening as she realized the implications faster than the others. Daniel Caldwell leaned back, overwhelmed, his confusion written clearly across his face. And Ethan Caldwell remained still, his reaction quieter, but no less aware. Richard said nothing at first. He let the silence do what it needed to do. Then, slowly, he spoke. The test was never about money. Those words settled heavily in the room, not because they were complicated, but because they forced everyone present to confront something they had not considered. This was not about inheritance, not about distribution, not about who deserved what based on position or expectation. It was about something far more direct, far more personal. With a simple gesture, Richard signaled to Charles Whitman, who then revealed what had been hidden behind the process everyone thought they understood. Every conversation, every decision, every private discussion that had taken place over the past days had been recorded. Not in a way that felt theatrical, but in a way that made it impossible to deny. The room, the hospital, the offices, all of it had been part of a controlled environment where actions mattered more than words. Richard began to speak again, this time not as a father, but as a man presenting truth. He addressed Andrew Caldwell first, outlining the attempts to gain early access to legal control, the quiet efforts to position himself ahead of the others. Then Vanessa Caldwell, whose calculated conversations and strategic pressure revealed a mindset focused not on family, but on outcome. Daniel Caldwell's actions followed, his instability, his external calls, his willingness to look beyond the family for security. Even Margaret Caldwell was not spared, her emotional distance, her subtle alignment, her shift from partner to observer when it mattered most. There were no raised voices now, no arguments, just silence and the weight of exposure. Every action had been seen, every intention understood, and every assumption brought into the open. And then Richard turned his attention to Ethan Caldwell. The room felt different in that moment, as if the tension itself had shifted direction. Ethan had not argued, had not competed, had not attempted to secure anything for himself. While the others moved with urgency, he remained consistent. While they focused on what they could gain, he focused on what was already there. He showed up without expectation, stayed without condition, and acted without calculation. Richard paused, allowing that contrast to settle fully before speaking the final words that would define everything that followed. Only one person would inherit everything. Because while everyone else was trying to take, they were the only one who chose to give. The silence that followed Richard Caldwell's decision was heavier than anything that had come before it. No one spoke immediately, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much to process at once. What had just been revealed could not be undone, and more importantly, it could not be denied. The structure of the will was simple, direct, and final. Ethan Caldwell would inherit the entirety of Richard's estate, not as a reward for strategy or position, but as a reflection of character. The rest would receive only what had already been assigned long before the test began, limited, fixed, and untouched by anything that had happened in those final days. It was not just a decision, it was a conclusion Richard had reached after watching everything unfold in real time. Margaret Caldwell sat back slowly, her composure returning, but not in the same form it once held. There was a realization in her expression, one that suggested understanding rather than resistance. Andrew Caldwell, for the first time, had no argument prepared, no position to defend. The certainty that had carried him through the entire process had disappeared, replaced by something far less controlled. Vanessa Caldwell remained still, her mind undoubtedly processing every detail, but even she had nothing to counter what had been revealed. Daniel Caldwell looked away, unable to face the outcome directly, as if avoiding it might somehow lessen its impact. Ethan Caldwell did not react in the way anyone might have expected. There was no visible sense of victory, no shift in posture, no claim of what had just been given to him. If anything, he remained exactly as he had been throughout the entire process, quiet, grounded, and unchanged. And in that stillness, the difference between him and the rest of the family became even more clear. The Caldwell family, once held together by shared history and the structure Richard had built around them, now stood divided by something much deeper. It was not the money that separated them, it was what had been revealed in the absence of certainty. The test had not created anything new, it had simply exposed what was already there, hidden beneath years of comfort and expectation. Richard Caldwell looked at each of them one last time, not with anger, but with clarity. What he had needed to know, he now understood completely. In the end, wealth didn't reveal who they were. It exposed who they had become. And as the room settled into a quiet that felt final, one question remained, not just for the people standing there, but for anyone hearing this story. If you were in that room, would you have passed the test? Stories like this don't just exist in imagination or on a movie screen, they unfold quietly in real life, in homes that look perfect from the outside, in families that believe they understand one another completely. And sometimes, it takes a single moment, a single decision, to reveal truths that were always there, waiting to be seen. If this story made you think, if it made you question what truly matters when everything is on the line, then you're already seeing beyond the surface. And if this one caught you off guard, the next story will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more real-life stories of power, betrayal, and truth.